On the night of the 28th of August, 1943, a Japanese officer named Kobayashi was carried along the north coast of New Guinea in a landing barge from Shio down to Finschhafen. The craft made about 8 knots. Its helmsman stood at the after end, behind a slab of steel with his head showing above the top edge, steering by the black line of the shore a few hundred yards off the port side. Nothing happened. The barge put its passengers on the beach before first light and turned around for the run home. Kobayashi wrote the trip up the following day, and the entry survives because an Allied unit later picked his diary off the ground. He noted that the crossing had been made with every precaution and that they had got through without incident, and he counted that as luck rather than as routine. Then he added what he had heard that morning. The barge unit that had carried him was attacked on the way back, and the barge commanding officer and his men were all lost. It is worth setting out what the barge line was by that summer, because the arrangement was not an act of desperation. It was a considered answer to a problem the Japanese had already tested to destruction. In March of 1943, off Lai, Allied aircraft caught a single convoy in the open. 8 transports and 4 destroyers went down out of it in the space of 3 days. Through July and early August, in the waters around New Georgia, 3 more destroyers and a light cruiser went down, trying to move troops and rice at night. Anything large enough to be worth a torpedo or a bomb was going to be found and killed inside the range of Allied airfields, and Japan did not have hulls to spare. So, the traffic was handed to craft that were too small to be worth killing. A barge was not worth a bomber's load, could not be torpedoed at all, and could be hidden in daylight under palm fronds cut that morning. It drew so little water that it could run inside reefs where a destroyer would rip her plating open. It cost almost nothing to build, and almost nothing to lose. Officers who had watched a convoy burn understood what they were being given, and they were not wrong about it. For most of a year, the barge line worked, and the men running it beat the force sent to stop them. The line itself was a chain of hiding places rather than a shipping lane. Along the north shore of New Britain, the staging points ran west from Cape Hoskins, through Talisea, Gorav Island, Iboki, Natamo, and Cape Gloucester, then around the western tip to Sagsag, and across the strait to Rook Island. The southern shore carried its own set at Gusmata, Araway, and Cape Bushing. Trails were cut between them, over the mountains and along the beaches, so that a stranded crew could walk to the next station. On the 6th of May, 1943, the Area Army Commander signed an order strengthening the sea transport base in the Cape Gloucester region and naming it as the supply base for all of his forces in the Leh area. Garrisons at these points were shipping engineers in the main, with a few medical men to look after troops passing through. The distances were short by design. A crew left one hiding place after dark, ran for a set number of hours, and was under camouflage again before the light came. Nobody crossed open water. Nobody kept a schedule that an enemy could learn. In the Solomons, the same method ran barges down from Choiseul to the top of Vella La Vella, and along the coast to the garrison at Vila, and up Kula Gulf into Bairoko, and it moved thousands of men and their rice, while the American Navy was still looking for warships to fight. The standard craft was a steel box 47 feet long with a ramp at the forward end, and its Japanese name meant nothing more exotic than large motorboat. It weighed about 21 tons, carried a 60 horsepower diesel, and made 8 knots flat out with a following sea. It could take 70 men, or 10 tons of cargo, or 1 light tank. A crew of 12 worked it. Its draft was 2 feet and 7 inches. That last figure decided the shape of the next year and a half of fighting in those waters, and it is worth holding on to. Armament was whatever the unit could bolt down. 2 light machine guns at first, then 25mm cannon, then anything heavier that could be scrounged and mounted, up to and including 40mm guns on the larger craft. Steel plate went on around the gun positions and along the sides, improvised in the field, thick enough in places to matter. The helmsman had his own slab in front of him. A barge that had been worked over by a unit that knew what it was doing was a small, low, armored gun platform that happened to be carrying rice, and it was almost invisible against a jungle shoreline at night. The thing that came hunting it was an 80-foot American motorboat with 3 aircraft engines in it. Those engines were 12-cylinder Packards turning out 1,500 horsepower apiece, burning aviation gasoline, and the boat carried 3,000 gallons of it. It could make better than 40 knots with a clean bottom, which is over 45 miles an hour on the water. Everyone called them Plywood boats, including their own crews, and the United States Navy's official history of the type says. The hull was not plywood at all, but 2 layers of mahogany planking laid over laminated wood frames with a sheet of aircraft fabric soaked in marine glue, ironed in between them. Plywood went into the cockpit and the joinery. The hull was a wooden shell built the way a fast-racing motorboat is built, light and springy and thin. From the steering position of a barge, none of that mattered as construction detail. What mattered was that bullets went through the American boat without stopping it. A wooden hull holed by rifle fire does not flood the way a steel one does, and the crews came home again and again with their boats punched full of holes, and nobody aboard hurt. What could stop one was a hit in the tanks, and when that happened, the entire boat went up in a single flash that lit the coastline for miles. The American boat also carried 4 torpedoes, and that is where the arithmetic breaks. A torpedo runs at a set depth. 6 feet was about as shallow as the weapons of the day could be persuaded to go without running wild, and even then, they were unreliable. The target drew 2 feet and 7 inches. The most powerful small warship for its size in the United States Navy, built around a torpedo battery meant for destroyers and cruisers, had arrived in waters where its main weapon could not be aimed at anything it was going to meet. The Navy's own history states the position without softening it. The barges were too small and too shallow to be worth a torpedo, and they carried heavier guns than the boats sent to hunt them. That second half took some weeks to believe. The first contact off Rendova came on the 21st of July, 1943, and by the end of that month, the boat captains had learned something that does not appear in any pre-war manual. On the night of the 26th, 3 of the boats found 6 large barges and opened on them at short range with 50 caliber machine guns and 20mm cannon. The fire bounced off. It went off the steel and away into the dark, and the 6 kept going. Then the American guns ran dry, all of them at once, and in the pause while the crews changed belts and drums, the barges turned toward them and opened fire. It was well handled. A crew that spots the reload, judges the range, and takes the initiative in a craft doing 8 knots against boats doing 40, is not a crew of frightened stores hands, and the American boats took a great many hits that night and were lucky to lose nobody. Out of that engagement came the first American counter, which was procedural rather than material. Keep the barge under fire without a break, because a gunner who is taking fire himself shoots less of it. Never let all guns empty together. Have a second boat cover the first one while it pulls away. Boat captains worked those 3 rules out in the Solomons in the last week of July 1943, and they owed every one of them to 6 enemy crews who had found the weak point first. The man who put the problem on paper was Lieutenant Commander Robert Kelly, who had brought a squadron of boats to Rendova at the end of June and had taken over the boats at Lever Harbor on the 26th of July. Late in August, he sat down and set out what his boats were up against, and the paper is one of the plainest things an American officer wrote about that campaign. Marine observers ashore at Inogai had counted 28 barges going in and out of Bairoko across 6 days. On 3 of those nights, his boats had attacked 17 of them and had achieved almost nothing, because the return fire from the barges and shore batteries has been so heavy that they could not get into a range where their guns would tell. The armored craft carrying 40mm guns were escorting the medium ones, which had nothing but machine guns and light cannon. To sink a single barge, Kelly wrote, a boat had to come in to inside 100 yards and put more than 1,000 rounds of 50 caliber and 500 of 20mm into it. That meant lying almost stopped for about 10 minutes inside the effective range of both the barges and the guns on the beach, and Kelly's phrase for what that amounted to was sacrificing the boat. Then he set out the part that turns the picture around. Without illumination, he wrote, his crews could not see barges that were hugging a dark shore. His own boats, though, showed up from the beach, silhouetted against the horizon in the moonlight. In the standard, telling the hunters are wooden and fast, and the prey is a slow steel box full of rice. In the paperwork of the men doing the hunting, through the second half of 1943, it was the barge crews who saw the other side first. His conclusion was that his boats were the wrong instrument for the job. The practical answer, he wrote, was to build armored craft of America's own and fight the enemy with his own kind of boat, or else to put guns ashore along the barge lanes and shoot the traffic from the land. His superiors agreed with him only in part. The endorsement that went forward with the August action reports conceded that using motor torpedo boats as barge destroyers left a great deal to be desired, and that doing it in daylight or bright moonlight was expensive beyond what was acceptable. It declined to accept that the boats were useless at it under all conditions, and it named the fix, which was neither of the two things Kelly had asked for. The boats would be given a heavier gun. 3 of them were to have their torpedo tubes and depth charges taken out altogether, and the weight saved would go into an automatic cannon and armor. That is the moment the whole thing turns, and it turns on weight. A torpedo boat carrying 4 torpedoes and their tubes has no margin left. Take the torpedoes off, and the boat has enough spare tonnage for a real gun, and a real gun is what kills an armored barge. The United States Navy had built a torpedo boat, sent it to a place with no targets for torpedoes, and discovered that the correct weapon was already in production for somebody else. The gun it settled on in the Solomons came out of an airplane. A single-shot anti-tank piece was tried first and turned down for its rate of fire. The automatic 37mm cannon fitted to Army fighter aircraft was then made available, and it went onto the forward deck as a standard installation. 3 boats in the Solomons had everything stripped off them except the heavy machine guns, and took 2 40mm mounts each, 1 forward and 1 aft, with 4 more twin 50s besides. In New Guinea, that heavier gun became the rule, and boats carrying it had authority to go out with 2 torpedoes instead of 4, or with none at all. By the end of the year, the fastest torpedo boat in the world was going to sea as a gunboat. The other half of the answer came from the air. Patrol planes painted black were assigned to work with the boats at night, and their job was to find the barges, tell the boats where they were, and drop flares over them. A flare changes everything for a crew that has spent the whole war depending on not being seen. It puts the barge in a lit circle on black water with an armed boat somewhere outside it in the dark, and it takes the crew's attention off their gunnery at the moment they need it most. Sometimes the plane would join in. Sometimes, if the boats had to break off, it would finish the job by itself. The armored landing barge has no film about it and no monument anywhere, and it beat the most famous small boat in the United States Navy for the better part of a year. A-like moves this one along tonight. A subscription decides whether the next unfilmed thing gets made at all. The effect ashore showed up before the barge crews could have measured it themselves. In a letter to the American boat commanders, an Australian Corps commander in New Guinea set out what his own intelligence people were seeing on the other side of the hill. Japanese diaries taken from the dead described a shortage of rations and daily working parties sent out to gather native food. A prisoner stated that 3 days of rice now had to last 9. In one area, the enemy had killed and eaten his pack animals. Reinforcements had reached the rear areas and could not be pushed forward because there was no way to feed larger numbers at the front. The line about the artillery is the one worth sitting with. In order to protect his barges, the Corps commander wrote, the enemy had been forced to spread his field guns along more than 50 miles of coastline. Those guns had been brought to New Guinea to shell Australian infantry. They were now parked at intervals along a beach, pointed out to sea, waiting for wooden motorboats that might or might not come that night. None of this stopped the traffic. Through the autumn and into the new year, the barges kept running, and the crews kept fighting back, and they kept scoring. Boats were hit by machine gun fire from the beach and from the barges. Boats grounded on unmapped reefs. Boats burned. Every night the barge units filed their claims, and the claims went up the chain to the Army headquarters that was keeping the books. And the books were what everyone above them used to decide whether the arrangement was still working. In March of 1944, the 17th Army wrote its monthly transport return for the Solomons, and that document is the single best thing anyone has what the barge campaign looked like from inside it. It is a clear-headed piece of work. It states that a line of communications built on landing barges appears to offer great capacity, but that constant interference from enemy aircraft and enemy motorboats, with occasional attacks by destroyers working with aircraft that dropped flares, had pushed all traffic into the hours of darkness and by preference into moonless nights. It notes that the method also needed suitable landing spots and hiding places, and that the capacity available in theory was therefore very difficult to realize. It states that in spite of all of it, the transport had been pushed through anyway. And then it gives the two numbers that the men writing it were using to judge their own situation. Since the 1st of February, they had sunk more than 10 of the enemy's motorboats. In the same period, they had lost more than 20 barges, large and small, which the report describes as 90% of the total number of barges possessed by the army. The second number is correct. The first is wrong by a factor of 10. In February and March of 1944, across the whole of the Solomons, the Americans lost a single motor torpedo boat to enemy action. Here is where the surviving paper runs out, and it is worth naming what is missing. No Japanese barge captain wrote a memoir. No interrogation exists of a shipping engineer who ran that line and came through it. What survives is a diary taken off a dead man, an army logistics return picked up in the field, and the reports of the men on the other side of the gunfire, and not one of those says what the crews themselves believed they were achieving. The comparison cuts one way as well. Wherever American ground troops moved into positions the Japanese had held, they kept finding wrecked barges on beaches and reefs that no boat crew had claimed, so the American figures were running low rather than high. There is no reason to think the 17th Army was inflating its own losses. The report was right about its own side and wrong about the other one. A force that cannot count what it is fighting has no way of knowing when to stop. The one boat had a number and a night. She was the 251, and on the night of the 25th of February 1944, she went down to Gazelle Harbor on the Bougainville coast in company with the 252. The stretch of shore they were working, from the Magian Islands past the mouths of the Java River and on to Motupena Point, was held by the Japanese along almost its whole length, and the barges ran it every night hard against the beach. Early in the evening, the two boats found one and sank it on the second firing run. Rifle fire came out of the barge, and machine gun fire came off the beach, and neither did any damage. At 10 minutes to 2 in the morning, the boats made contact with the patrol plane working that sector and asked for light. 3 barges appeared in the flares, 300 yards off the beach south of the river. Both boats ran in and opened fire. The plane strafed and dropped 2 bombs alongside, and mortars and machine guns on shore tried to push the boats back out. 1 barge drove itself up the beach. 2 ran for open water. The boats came in to 75 yards and watched 1 go under and then had to break off, because the guns on both boats had jammed. Half an hour later, and a mile and a half further south, they found 6 more barges in 2 groups, running within 100 yards of the sand. They shot up all of them. A large barge came up astern of the 251 and was fired on with no result anybody could see. More flares went down. Another barge was worked over between the flares and a signal light burning on the beach. Then the 252 turned on a barge that appeared 50 yards off her port side, and at the end of that run the barge was going down by the stern and the 251 was hard aground on a reef. She could not be moved. The 252 put herself on the same reef trying to help and managed to back off. 2 more boats came down at 4:45 and spent over an hour feeling their way in with a sounding line to get a tow line across. The 252 had worked in to within 75 yards when a gun on shore started shooting at the stranded boat. The first round went over, the second went under, the third hit her, and 3,000 gallons of aviation gasoline did the rest. 3 men were pulled out of the water. When the light came, the boats and the aircraft went over the whole area and found nobody else. 2 officers and 11 men were gone. Back at base that morning, somebody found an unexploded 57mm shell sitting in the warhead of one of the other boat's torpedoes. 1 more, and it cost nothing. Kelly's argument that his boats were the wrong tool for the job and the Navy should have built armored craft of its own instead, never got settled either way, so leave a verdict on it in the comments. And on a phone, there is a hype button sitting under the video. Tapping it is the fastest way there is to push something like this at people who would never go looking for it. On the 26th of February, 1944, the United States Navy lost one motor torpedo boat in the Solomon Islands, 2 barges. The other patrol section had worked over that night lay beached a short distance up the same reef, and the light came up on all 3 of them together.